share with our speaker what we've done with the granite artifacts here in Westerly, and going through the vault and the various findings down in the vault so that you can see where we are. Our speaker today is William Hosley. If you say Connecticut, if you say history, then you say William Hosley. He's a very accomplished historian and speaker on Connecticut. And you say, well, why is he here in Rhode Island?
It's all of a mile away.
Spitting distance away. And he will share with us the connection through James Batterson. We welcome you here today. We're very pleased to have this program in our repertoire because James Batterson is somebody we need to know about in the Westerly granite business. So, Bill?
Great. And if we could get the lights out, that would be great. I've been visiting Westerly for 40 years from periodically. And it's a beautiful, I love the downtown. You've got this fabulous library, and of course this museum is outstanding. And it's, to me, the joy of New England is that we have all these little towns and small cities, and no two are alike. Every place has a different story, and it sort of depends on the kinds of things like granite that maybe a place had as a local industry. But I think the business, the work of local history is incredibly inspiring and important. And when you look at the world we live in today and all the antagonism and unpleasantness in politics and other things, the one thing for sure is that local history is something that gives people a sense of civic attachment, a feeling of connection to a place. And I think that overrides all that political ugliness. And it's such a powerful thing. And if I had a magic wand, our schools, the highest priority in our schools would be to not only bring kids here, but to really use the content underfoot as a teaching tool. And there is so much of it everywhere, but certainly here in Westerly. Well, I learned more today in the basement with looking at your archives than I know already about this subject, so it's a little embarrassing. If I come back a couple of years, maybe I could, but I mean, I just scratched the surface. You're sitting on an incredible gold mine of archival information. It's just, I've never seen anything like it for any local industry. I mean, it's just, you've got records on top of records and photographs and all the volunteerism and work that you've done. And how do you not love a local industry whose product was art? I mean, in other words, a lot of people if they didn't get really rich, they at least did well. They made livings making art. And this was public art. And I was, sort of joking with Linda and others, what a nightmare this past month has been with this whole thing about the Confederate monuments and all the ugliness and the things that people are saying about, I'm not in favor of the Confederate cause, of course, but it's part of our history. And it seems to me reckless and a little crazy to destroy monuments. But the one point that I couldn't believe it, I mean, here's this Charlottesville, it's like the biggest news story of 2017, and there's a big chunk of Westerly granite at the center of this story. And I said, look, I'll help you, I'll double back. I said, hey, they don't want it? Send the granite back here. You could put it right in the yard. It would be the biggest news story in Westerly, and it wouldn't cost that much to ship it. And right now, when they're feeling sort of lousy and confused, that's when you get them. You go in for the kill. And I joke about this, but this is a story that you'll like. My wife is the director of the Windsor, Connecticut Historical Society, and some of you probably know, in fact, it could be Westerly granite on the base of it. But 20 years ago, when the casinos were coming up, a group of the Indians got upset because there was a statue of John Mason in Mystic. And they thought he was a bloodthirsty terrorist or whatever, and they didn't want him there anymore. And he was from Windsor, Connecticut. And so the Windsor Historical Society said, we'll take it. and they moved the thing from Mystic to Windsor, and it's this incredible piece of art. It's bronze, not the base is granite, but it's an incredible piece of art in the Palisado Green section of Windsor, right across the street from the Historical Society. So it's a wonderful teaching tool, and when they do tours, the graveyard, the first church, the meadows where the 400 years of farming have taken place are all right there within walking distance, and to have that statue as part of it just adds to the stories that they can tell in that location. And that was a big deal for the Windsor Historical Society, because if you wanted to commission something like that today, it would cost you $500,000 or more. I mean, that's a pretty amazing work of art. So I'd love to see that little Stonewall Jackson. Maybe not the bronze. They could do what they want with the bronze, but the granite piece that was made here in Westerly would be completely awesome to bring back. So we'll see. But anyway, I wrote a book about Sam and Elizabeth Colt revolvers. And I was formerly a curator and exhibit developer at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford. And in 1905, Sam Colt's widow, Elizabeth Colt, donated this incredible collection of art and family memorabilia to the Wadsworth Atheneum where I worked. And she donated a bunch of money to build a building to house it. So Elizabeth Colt was one of the most important benefactors in the history of the city. And so we did this major exhibition, and I did a lot of research and reading, among other things, reading the newspapers every day from 1844 until the 1890s. And that takes a while, and in those days it wasn't on the internet. This is in the 1990s. So I'd go over to the Connecticut Historical Society and with the hard copies, paper, and day after day looking for interesting stories that would give me a context to help me understand what was going on in Hartford during the Colts era. And of course the Colts made news and there were stories, but I kept turning up this name Batterson over and over and over again. And James Batterson, as it turned out, was a contemporary of the Colts, a friend of the Colts. We'll hear more about that in a big way, and one of the most significant movers and shakers in Hartford at the height of the Gilded Age, when Hartford was like one of the richest cities in America. So there's a big story there, as I'm sure most of you know. In his spare time, when he wasn't busy with the Monument Company, he founded Travelers Insurance Company. So he had not just the monument business that he was running, but he was building this insurance company that became this giant leviathan that still very much exists. And he had actually another third business on the side that made brass picture frames, because he was really interested, as you will see, in art. It was fun downstairs because you had a trade catalog for the New England Granite Company, which Batterson's company, became. And on the cover of the trade catalog, it had this sort of artistic cover, and it said something like, since 1845. And there it is, right there. And what that was, it was a signifying that was the year that James Batterson arrived in Hartford. And as I opened with this presentation, in 1845, a young man from the Marble District of the Litchfield Hills arrived in Hartford just as the city's new rail line helped trigger an industrial boom that by 1870 made it one of the richest small cities in America. At age 22, James G. Batterson established himself as a manufacturer of monuments and gravestones and an importer and dealer of, quote, the best American and Italian marble. He expanded into building construction. His monuments, architectural, and memorial helped define the Gilded Age nationwide with some of the 19th century America's most celebrated landmarks. Batterson's story is an evocative case study of the transformation of a small shop artisan into mass market, large-scale manufacturing. And, gravestone making, if you poked around the old graveyards in Rhode Island, and you probably know about the Bensons in Newport, but there are gravestones everywhere. And if you go back to the 18th century, gravestones were made by artisans whose shops were smaller than this room. And if they had an apprentice or a journeyman, it wasn't much more than that. And maybe they and some of them were farmers who dabbled in gravestone making. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a full-time job, though I think the Bensons in Newport made it one. But these were small shops. And by the era of Smith Brothers and Batterson, these were huge industries employing hundreds of people. So it changed, if not overnight, at least in one generation. Despite only a common school education, Batterson was a relentless self-improver who studied geology under the state geologist J.G. Percival, mastered half a dozen languages, traveled to Egypt to study ancient sepulchral art of, gravestones in Egypt, and in 1859 was commissioned by Sam Colt and a group of Hartford subscribers to travel to Italy to retrieve the effects of the then celebrated, recently deceased American sculptor and Connecticut native Edward Bartholomew. Batterson delayed his return to study paintings and sculpture in Italy and began forming a collection of European Old and New Master paintings. Monument maker, builder, linguist, economist, politician, art collector, and insurance magnate, James Batterson was eventually awarded an honorary degrees from Yale and Williams College and was a trustee of Brown University. Where's Linda? And he only had a grade school education. Also a trustee at Wadsworth, Atheneum, and more. An almost quintessential model of the self-made man. So, and that, of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, but I'm sure you know it. This is actually a photograph. I opened with a picture in Westerly, and this was the famous soldier at rest, the Antietam Monument. And at the time, this was, I think, maybe the biggest. This is earlier than the Statue of Liberty. And I think this was the biggest figural statue that had ever been produced in the United States at the time that it was new. This is about 1872, or I'm not sure when that photograph was taken, but that's on one of those stereo photographs. And this again shows the small shop stonecutter, what the industry was prior to the industrial age. And there's so much to learn about technology and patents. I know Batterson patents some machinery. I don't know the half of it. There aren't lots of photographs of the inner workings of the monument industry, and very few people, you probably know more here than any community in the country about how the monument industry actually worked. Although you do have places like Barre, Vermont, and Quincy, Massachusetts, and even we were talking about Gloucester, Massachusetts. There are other places in the country where the monument industry was significant, but I don't think any of them have done a better job than you all have at preserving that history, and with the incredible archives you've got. It really is a nationally significant story. I love old gravestones. I've been poking around graveyards since I was a teenager, and the folk art is great. Some of the hardcore folk art, the people that love these 18th century gravestones, the 19th century doesn't interest them too much. But I love it all. I think it's all interesting. And so by the time I got started with this project, I'd already spent 25 years poking around graveyards. I recently met one of the founders of the Association for Gravestone Studies, somebody I've known for 40 years, and I hadn't seen him in a long time. And we were kind of comparing notes, and I said to him, I think at this point, my wife and I have probably been to 500 graveyards. And he said, is that all? He says, those are rookie numbers. But it is endlessly fascinating, and the stuff you see, the art, and the fact that they were actually able to do a lot of this stuff without, machinery and without, modern technology is amazing. So this is, interestingly, and again, I don't pretend to have exhausted this topic, but James Batterson was the son of Simeon S. Batterson, and his father was a monument maker, and he was born in, Simeon Seeley Batterson, SS, his father, born in 1800, was the great-great-grandson of a Scotch-Irish immigrant who settled Boston about 1700. His great-grandfather, James, went to Fairfield, Connecticut about 1735. His father, George, relocated to the Wintonbury section of Windsor, Connecticut about 1800, where James was born in 1823. And I have studied the father who made all these gravestones, or some of them, but I have not really studied the grandfather, George, and what did he do? And is it possible that stone cutting had been in the family for more generations than we realize? But at least the father certainly was a monument maker. It's not clear if if James' grandfather was a stone cutter, though I'm sure that can be determined through various probate records and other kinds of documentation. Where James, let me see. It's not clear if James' grandfather was a stone cutter, but the earliest signed work by his father predates his birth. And Simeon remained involved in the monument business until his death in 1871. And so, like, this is signed by Simeon Batterson. It's in Suffield, Connecticut, and it's dated 1820. So you get the sense that they, the family then relocated to the marble quarry area of New Preston, Connecticut, out in the Litchfield Hills, when James was about 10, and developed a moderately thriving monument business in Litchfield, where young James worked before relocating to Hartford, by which time his father's gravestones were in demand throughout Litchfield County, Hartford County, and even in eastern Connecticut. So the father was fairly successful, and while there's no real records of this, it's certain that James Batterson not only apprenticed to his father, but was kind of like a partner in the business at the age of 20. And for whatever reason, he decided, as I've already mentioned, to relocate to Hartford. I visit a lot of local historical societies. I've been to hundreds of them. And I was in Framingham, Massachusetts, outside of Boston a few years ago, and they had a grandfather clock. Well, you see tall clocks everywhere. But I saw the name James Batterson on it, and I was like, oh my, what is this? That's an unusual name. And it turned out that this was the great-grandfather, James Batterson, born in 1682. Not exactly clear when he arrived, possibly trained in England, but this was a very fancy, pretty important clock from about 1725, and again, establishes that sense of mechanical ability in the family tree. So there's a lot more that can be learned about them, I'm sure. But the great-grandfather was a clockmaker in the Boston area. And this gives you a little sense of the genealogy. And so he moves to Hartford in 1845, and it's interesting. These are some of the gravestones that are signed. It says Batterson, Litchfield, and this is the kind of work that they were doing in the 1840s when young James was still sort of an apprentice with his father. This one on the right is in Waterville, Connecticut, near Waterbury, and the one on the left is in Norfolk, Connecticut, out near Litchfield, northwest. So he arrives the same year as the railroad, and this is the first railroad station in Hartford. And in short order, he's advertising in the newspapers. James Batterson, marble manufacturer, Hartford and Litchfield, Connecticut, respectfully announces to the citizens of Hartford and to the public generally that he has opened an establishment on Main Street where he will manufacture at the lowest possible prices all kinds of monuments and gravestones in the best American Italian marble, chimney pieces, mantles, center table, pier tables. So anything made of marble, he's ready to make it. But it was a small operation. And, when you go, if you spend enough time in graveyards, you know that signed gravestones, where the maker signs the gravestone, they're pretty rare. They're not that common. Most gravestones aren't signed. But my field research for this project really consisted of just visiting a lot of graveyards, not even with Batterson in mind necessarily, but when I'd stumble on something that was signed, I'd photograph it. And this is in Colchester, Connecticut, J.G. Batterson, 1849. So this is pretty early. He just started out in 1845. And then this Fitch is in Coventry, Connecticut from 1848. So these are marble tablets with a little bit of decoration, nothing that particularly stands out in a big way. About 1850, again, someday the book will be written, but the technology for bronze casting and also for increasing the scale of monuments really began to take off in the 1850s, and I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, the demand, people were willing to spend a lot more money than just a tablet. If you're building something like this, that's probably the equivalent of today of a couple $100,000. I mean, these were not inexpensive. And on the left there is a monument shop in New York City from about, well, it says 1850. I think the photograph might be from the 1860s, but you get an idea of how the industry is beginning to take off. This is a house museum. When I was the director of the Connecticut Landmark Society, we had a collection of historic houses. The closest ones to you here are the Hempstead houses in New London, which may be familiar to you. But this is the Isham Terry House in Hartford, which was almost across the street from Batterson's shop. And it was built in the 1850s, and this is the kind of thing he's advertising when he talks about marble mantelpieces. We don't have precise documentation on this particular thing, but I think it's an educated guess that that's probably was from the Batterson shop, and the kind of thing certainly that they were doing. 1851 was the first of the great World's Fairs, the great exhibition in London. And one of the stars of the show was the Hiram Powers, was an American marble sculptor, and this is the Greek Slave. And it became one of the most celebrated examples of American art that had ever been shown to the public. And it toured all around the country, and it was in the World's Fair. And you can see how prominent statuary was at this World's Fair. These are pictures from 1851. So things are getting exciting in the monument business. There's the Greek Slave. And on the left is Chauncey Ives, was a Connecticut sculptor from New Haven, and he did the one on the left, far left, and then the Greek Slave is in the middle, and on the right. There I think are 3 or 4 known copies of this famous sculpture, and one of them is actually at the Yale Art Gallery. So again, it was 1851, and this was the cutting edge of art and technology. Well, there's Sam Colt on the left, and there's James Batterson, not at the age of 22, I'm pretty sure. He probably was a little thinner when he started out, but he arrives in Hartford about the same time as Colt, and they became fellow travelers in promoting industrialization and art. Colt, a superstar at the Great Exhibition in London, became friends with Hiram Powers, who did the Greek Slave, and a devotee of statuary. In 1862, James Batterson organized what was described in the newspaper as an immense open-air war meeting. Had to do with Civil War, the beginning of the Civil War. And when he wasn't busy, he founded Travelers in the middle of the Civil War in 1863. But at 1862, at the age of maybe 40, early 40s, he is the president or the chairman of the Connecticut State Republican Party, which, the Union, the North were the Republicans and the South, frankly, were the Democrats during the Civil War. And that's just the way the history worked. And so Batterson was in the dominant party that was waging this war, and he had a lot of influence. And so he's involved in politics. Sam Colt is involved in politics, and these were just the most hair-raising, extraordinary times. Obviously, to have lived through the Civil War is to have been impressed in a way that it's almost hard for us to imagine. I don't think anything in my lifetime was as traumatic and had such a huge legacy impact on the country as that Civil War did. and there were speeches by the governor and generals, and Batterson spoke, and Batterson spoke of, he actually quoted Jefferson Davis, who had visited Hartford a couple of years earlier. He calls, and Batterson is quoting Jefferson Davis, he says, Jefferson Davis calls mechanics such as you mudsills. I would rather be a mudsill and carve gravestones than be King Cotton. So he was, getting people excited about the politics. Again, Colt at the Great Exhibition had seen this. This was the largest bronze figure that had ever been cast in the world. It was an Amazon. If any of you saw Wonder Woman this summer, which is great, that's Wonder Woman right there, and she's on a horse, and this lion is attacking the horse, but I think he's going to get it, you see, because she's Wonder Woman. And Colt loved this, and he brought a copy of it back to Hartford, and then commissioned this incredible rampant Colt. This became the trademark of the Colt company. This rampant Colt, and that's also in zinc, I think it is. But the point, again, is that the two of them, sculpture was really beginning to take off. They had a friendship. And in 1852, Sam Colt had come back from England, filled with ideas and aspirations at the World's Fair. And in 1852, he commissions Batterson to design a monument for his family. And at the time, this is the Colt Monument in Old North Cemetery in Hartford. And it's signed by Batterson, actually. It says, maybe I have a detail, but it says Batterson, like right in here. And at the time, this doesn't look so impressive compared, we were talking about General, was it Wool in Troy, New York? Is that the one?
Yep.
Well, that's big, right? Mm-hmm. This isn't so big, right? But it's 20 years earlier. And at the time, something with the scale of this would have just blown people away. And it's also the earliest use, for people who are into the Colt thing, this is the Colt, a rampant Colt trademark, earliest use of the trademark in art that we know of. And this is a sort of a coat of arms that Sam Colt cooked up. So he commissions Batterson to make this. And at the time, I'm sure it was the most ambitious thing that the Batterson shop had produced. He gets these are just some of the monuments that are around. This is Lewis Ledyard Weld, 1865, led black troops in the Civil War, which is like that movie Glory. And they were abolitionists and hardcore, and he died. He and his brother died in the Civil War. And you see this classical figure with the capital of the, sort of allegorical of the capital of the column cut down in the sort of mourning classical woman, and then the beautiful drapery on the back of it. I mean, this is a real extraordinary work of art, also signed by the Batterson firm. In 1854, he gets a commission to design a monument honoring Thomas Galladay, who was a Hartford, he was one of the founders of the American School for the Deaf, and they developed the American Sign Language, and it was the first college in the country that was focused on the needs of hearing impaired and the science of communication. And he was nationally famous, Thomas Gallaudet. And this is the monument that Batterson's firm was commissioned to create for him. And it's got these little bas-relief marble inserts. And, and this was a print that was made that to commemorate the monument. So it was a work of art about a work of art. And Batterson had made this. And these are the things that are beginning to earn him a national reputation. It made national news at the time. The bas-relief was actually designed by a deaf-mute artist named John Carlin. And so all that's part of the documentation. The promotional print was designed itself by a deaf-mute named Albert Newsom. So this was an important moment for Batterson and for them. Then in about the same year, 1853 in this case, General David Wooster was a significant military figure in the American Revolution. and he died at the Battle of Ridgefield, fighting side by side with Benedict Arnold when Benedict Arnold was still on the right side, 1777. And this is in Danbury, Connecticut, and is the Worcester Monument that was commissioned to remember this Revolutionary War general. And the scale of this is even bigger. I mean, it's so, and it's got all of these, again, bas-relief inserts, and you know, it's pretty extraordinary. So if you think this is 1854, actually 1853, if you see that just 5 years earlier, he was doing these little tablets, and that's it. There's a huge leap right in that period, late 40s, early 50s, when the scale and technical capacities of this firm go from here to way up here. And each of these commissions, you know, makes national news. Then in 1857, he gets a commission. This is still at a very prominent location in New York City, the William Jenkins Worth Memorial on Broadway and at 24th Street. And I took that picture, I think, and it's there. You can't miss it. And it's granite now, but with bronze inserts and appliques. And this, I don't know all the details about it, but this obviously was another newsworthy accomplishment. This is now the scale, or even bigger, than the things you think of in the Gilded Age, the Victorian period, that are so gigantic. But they're still in the 1850s. This is 1857. And again, this is a golden age for sculpture. And if you visit museums that have these marble bronzes, marble busts, and there are quite a few at the Wadsworth Atheneum. I'm sure the Rhode Island School of Design has, I know they do. If you look at the dates on the labels, you'll find a lot of that stuff is from the 40s and 50s, some of it from the 1860s. So there's like a 30-year period where sculpture is the hottest thing going on in art. And that on the left is actually of Daniel Wadsworth, the founder of the Wadsworth Atheneum, and then Horace Bushnell, who was a minister in Hartford, and there by Chauncey Ives. I mentioned Edward Bartholomew. Batterson gave, this is a great story, this Bartholomew, it's amazing we have a photograph of him because he died in 1858, but there is a photo of him. He was the first curator. He was the guy that opened the door and took care of visitors at the Wadsworth Atheneum when it was brand new in the 1840s. And he loved art. He was from Colchester, and he wanted to be an artist. But he had this little job in the museum, and he and Batterson met. And the problem is he was colorblind. And Batterson says, well, you know, colorblind shouldn't stop you from having a career in art. And he apparently gave him stonecutter tools and some preliminary lessons. And this guy just took off like a bullet. He went over to Europe and had a studio in Rome. And then he begins entering these competitions and making national news. And by the time of his death, this is a statue at the Wadsworth Atheneum. It's called Eve Repentant, and it's the way it was described in the newspapers. People would stand there like in tears, looking at this figure of Eve, because they felt that Bartholomew had captured that quality of grief and remorse like nobody had ever done in Western art. We know that Eve, well, some say she did a bad thing. We don't know. Maybe not so bad, but pretty bad. And that we are led to believe she felt bad about it. At least if you look at this, she doesn't look too happy, does she? So, and the serpent's there misbehaving. So, you know, this was great art. And they had a banquet in 1858 because there was Edward Bartholomew had achieved national, international fame. The other Hartford artist of the exact same time period to achieve national and international fame was the much better known today, Frederick Church, the painter. And they had this big banquet for them. And at the banquet, Sam Colt stood up and said, I'm going to commission I'm going to commission some art from Bartholomew. So this is a Edward Bartholomew, who Batterson gave the tools to. That's Sam Colt, that's his wife Elizabeth, that's their first child. And these were by this Edward Bartholomew. Sam Colt dies in 1862, but their mansion, which was the biggest thing Hartford ever saw, still standing. His wife lived there for another 43 years, Elizabeth. And in the, they had these incredible gardens and grounds. And one of the things that Elizabeth Colt hired Batterson to do is to decorate the gardens with statuary. And these are reproductions of famous European works of art. I don't think Batterson's shop made them, but Batterson had connections in the monument business and statuary business. They may have come from Europe. They are long gone. Nobody knows what happened to them. When she died, she left the 100 acres to the city of Hartford for a park. And I think within 5 years, the park was kind of high maintenance. And I think within 5 years, the statues had been removed, what was left of them. But this shows what the Colts' grounds looked like, and again, their appreciation for art. I learned more today, again, that I knew before I arrived. All the years that I've spent studying this, I learned more from your incredible archives. But I already had known that Batterson, by the late 50s, and certainly during the 1860s, was beginning to sell his monuments and statuary outside of Connecticut. It wasn't just in Connecticut. In fact, it wasn't even just in New England. And the first mother lode of Batterson monuments that I ever photographed in situ was at Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. And I don't know what his connection was to Cincinnati, but he did a lot of business there, and he did it early. These are from 1859 on the left, and 1857. This is a family vault that the Batterson firm were paid to build. And you know, exactly the mechanics of that, how they, did they make the parts? And go ahead, did you have a point?
Do you know the name of the family
Oh,
vault?
yeah, yes. On the right is the Jacob Straden Vault, 1857, and on the left is George Washington Neff, 1859. And these are signed, so it gives you a little something there. Again, Elizabeth Colt, after Sam's death, she incorporates the Bartholomew figure into this. Sam Colt initially is buried on the grounds of the estate. That changes later, it's another story. But she remains involved with, again, Batterson, and engages him to bring some of the statuary to the garden, the formal gardens at the Colt estate. Then in 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War, the city of Hartford decides that they want one of these modern rural cemeteries, you know, a much bigger kind of cemetery than they had. And the ancient burying ground in Hartford goes back to the early 1600s, and that's like 6 acres downtown. Maybe it's less than that. Then Old North Cemetery in the north end is much bigger. That was founded in 1808 and remained popular through the 19th century. But in 1864, Cedar Hill Cemetery in the south end of Hartford became, you know, where the Gilded Age elite, the people with money, and others. It's just a beautiful, and it's beautifully maintained. And if you're ever in Hartford, Cedar Hill Cemetery is breathtaking, particularly in May and October, because they've got wonderful plantings as well. Anyway, Elizabeth Colt decided she was going to get with it. So in the very first year before one of the first monuments that is erected there is the Colt family monument. And up to that point, Sam Colt and the children were buried literally in a little fenced-in lot on the estate. But in 1864, a few years later, she removes them all to Cedar Hill. And this is the monument she commissions Batterson to build. So we saw in 1852, Colt commissioning Batterson to do that marble we saw, that was a big deal at the time, this is much bigger. And it is also pushing the envelope in terms of technology. It uses that red granite that was imported from Scotland. So this is very high-end stuff, and it's got these bronze appliques. And then Randolph Rogers, who was a prominent sculptor, you can see his work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and elsewhere, was commissioned to do this figure of Gabriel that went on top of it. So this was sending a message about the Gilded Age, and the Colts were kind of show-offs. They had a lot of money, and they liked people to know it. So this was moving monuments again to the next level. Various monuments all signed. Again, the documentation you have here is so fantastic. It doesn't cover those earliest years from the 50s and 60s. And one of the things we talked about is what happened to those records. And it is possible that some of that stuff is buried in the archives at Travelers Insurance Company, but I have never turned them up. And but what you know beginning in the 70s is all the different clients that they had and where you could find these things. What I learned, the two ways I discovered Batterson monuments, is that I just stumbled on ones that were signed. The other way is that there were many, many newspaper stories during his lifetime. When something impressive was built, they'd make sure there was a little news story. So I was able to document quite a bit from the newspapers. On the left is 1860 Jedediah Burnham in Hampton, Connecticut. In the center is marble, I think, and that's the Ashmead Monument in Old North Cemetery in Hartford, 1850s. And on the right is Spring Grove Cemetery in Hartford, 1867, the Clapp family. On the left is the Pearson Monument these are all signed, in Windsor, in the center, Dwight Loomis in Suffield, and on the right is the Reed family, that's also in Suffield, and it's got this feature that is, I didn't mean to do that. It doesn't matter. Let's hope I don't destroy anything. Now what have I done? Huh? Now what have I done? Uh-oh.
While you're doing that, those look like brownstone?
Yeah.
Did he own quarries of
Let me just.
brownstone as well?
I hope I can get this. Just
What's
a
that?
sec. What?
Slideshow.
I don't want to go to the beginning. All right, good. Yeah.
This will give you the pointer, the center.
Oh, the center will. Yeah, what I was trying. Oh, good. There we go. This is this feature. He traveled to Egypt in the 1850s and 60s, and this was, I don't know, something about Luxor, Egypt. I don't even know the details, but this was a feature that he discovered, and it became kind of like a signature. It's something I'm not sure other monument makers did. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it's distinctive enough that when you see this, that's often a Batterson monument, whether it's signed or not. Yes, brownstone, marble. I think marble was the cheapest, or brownstone, not sure. The granite was more expensive, but they were in business to make money, and if you didn't have the money for granite, they were good. They could make it brownstone. A lot of the stuff is in brownstone. I would say probably I've seen more, maybe not. Maybe half of it's in granite. I don't know.
Early stuff tends to be more brownstone than the later
Thank you.
stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure that's correct. And these are in red Scottish granite on the left, in Schenectady, New York. Indianapolis in the center, that was the first really big one I ever saw that far west from 1867. I was thrilled because, again, part of the story here that's so beautifully documented in your archives is that this business was national. They were shipping stuff everywhere. I mean, it's really pretty amazing. And then on the right is Binghamton, New York, 1871. Rhode Island granite, I mean, again, exactly. I think maybe Westerly was the first place he got granite from. It wasn't the only place. And I think they obviously had a shop here, and y'all know more about his Westerly operations than I do. They had a sculpture shop in Hartford, But by what year? 1868? They also had a shop down here, and I think that after that period, probably more of the stuff was produced here than in Hartford. But I think Batterson's base, I don't know where the design, I don't know where the business, I mean, there are many, many questions that need to be asked. But I think Hartford did not, the whole business did not move to Westerly, but a lot of it did. And these are granites. On the left is actually the founder of the Connecticut Historical Society, 1856, Thomas Robbins, and on the right is Willimantic, 1863. These are so great, and I stumbled on this photograph, if you can believe it, on the right, in like a flea market 30 years ago, and I think I paid $10 for it or $8, ridiculous. And they're not unique, it's not the only example, but I just, I was into this stuff enough to realize that the inner workings of a monument shop were rarely photographed. So this is a very important document. And by the way, Batterson was the first to begin recruiting Italians to work in Hartford. That's in the 1850s. And so these are probably, some of them are Italians to be sure, because some of the best, stonecutters and craftsmen were from Italy, but this is early. And so that's the inner workings of his shop, and this is the shop. That's what it looked like on the outside. So these are very rare photographs, and this shows the operations in Hartford. Probably these photos were taken about 1870. And then this, of course, is Westerly. Linda, this building, are there other photographs of this building? I assume that was the shop, or one of the buildings.
There are other photographs of this Antietam soldier
Yeah.
In this setting. One with Tom Thumb posing in front of him, so you get even more contrast.
Yeah, but
That was up on Leadwood Avenue, just
okay,
around the corner.
but it's pretty clear that that's the same building,
Yep.
just from a different angle, and it's pretty amazing. In the newspapers, about the time these pictures were taken, I forget the name of it, whether it was the Hartford Art Society, but a group of rich people from Hartford, no other way to put it, boarded a train for a field trip to Westerly to visit the site of this, because it was already so newsworthy that one of our local guys has a shop down in Westerly, and they're now raising the bar on statuary in a big way. You've got to see this. And it went off to the Centennial and the World's Fair, and it was based, this is called The Soldier at Parade Rest, symbolic of the peaceful discipline and order that the military subscribed to. And the Soldier at Parade Rest was, again, the subject for the Antietam Monument, which was exhibited at the Centennial at the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876 before it went off. This is at the Centennial on the right, and on the left is the National Monument at Antietam Battleground. Has anybody been there, by the way, Antietam? Doesn't it take your breath away? I mean, it is a powerful thing. Oh my God. Bloodiest single day of the Civil War. And, look, 1 million people a year stare at this thing. It's just, probably 99% of them don't notice that it's actually signed right on the base. Hartford, Connecticut, J.G. Batterson. And what elements were actually made there? I'm sure this is mostly Westerly granite again, although these figures are marble. But what an amazing, and part of the joke really, because Batterson was involved in, he was, again, the head of the Republican Party in Connecticut. So he had lots of contacts in the military and in government. So after the Civil War, when there was this bonanza of commissions for Civil War monuments, he had the best contacts, political contacts, of anyone in the monument industry, because he'd done this other job during the Civil War. So, everybody in the monument business would have turned somersaults to get the commission for the National Monument at Gettysburg. That was going to be a very costly and high-profile commission, but Batterson got it, and I think the year was it was designed in 1865, 60 feet high, crowned with a statue representing the genius of liberty, projecting from the angles of the pedestal buttresses with allegorical figures of war, history, peace, and plenty. History is in a listening attitude, records with a stylus and tablet. Designs submitted to a committee with names of designers withheld, according to what they said. So, but they won. They won the commission. And in the wake of that, more commissions followed. This is Norwich, Connecticut, and I was looking at some of the documentation for this monument downstairs. This is in Deerfield, Mass, and Stockbridge. And let me get this straight. Yeah, Deerfield on the right, and then Stockbridge, Mass, on the left. These are both brownstone, but it's interesting that this one has a bronze eagle. So they while there are some repetitive elements that you see over and over again, there's also a lot of customization. So they're pretty interesting. This is East Bloomfield, New York, which is this little town south of Rochester, New York, and it is literally the largest of the brownstones I've ever seen. And it is kind of amazing. And this also, I don't think this is signed, though I'm not absolutely sure. I knew this one because of the newspaper articles about it. This is in Crown Point, New York, and it's, I think, the only Civil War monument I've seen in marble by them. And that was also documented. On the right is East Hartford, Connecticut. So the Stockbridge had the bronze eagle. This has the brownstone eagle. And these are all Civil War monuments. Then he had this German sculptor, architect that worked for me. He had employed, I'm not saying Batterson didn't design all this stuff. He designed maybe some of it. But he had a firm at this point. He had a lot of specialists that worked for him. And Carl Conrad's was one of them. And he designed this monument in Detroit. And we were looking at the documentation downstairs. We were talking about Roland Mather. And this is the National Monument at Gettysburg, which Batterson did not design. It was the biggest figural statue in the country before, I'm trying to remember the order. Antietam, Forefathers in Plymouth, and then the Statue of Liberty. And I can't remember the exact sequence. I don't think this actually was built until 1870 something. So I'm not exactly sure, but this was famously huge. And this is the marble insert that Roland Mather commissioned. And probably from Batterson, but it's not. No, I do know that because it's actually signed by the same Carl Conrad, you can see barely, who did this figure, this Civil War monument in Detroit. So it's just, interesting little. So, all right, so Batterson starts out in the country. I assume that he didn't live in a big mansion growing up in Bloomfield or Litchfield, but by the 1870s, he's pretty rich. And so he builds this little house in Hartford on Albany Avenue in 1875. And he is a collector. As I mentioned, when he was in Europe in the 1850s, he begins visiting European museums, and he's one of the first art collectors in Connecticut. And in 1868, the Wadsworth Athenaeum mounted the first exhibition loan show they ever had mounted of Batterson's art collection. He was elected a trustee of the Athenaeum at the age of 38, and he was elected vice president of the board a few years later. And this is some of the art in his collection. Unfortunately, this collection was, I guess there are a few things known, but most of it was dispersed. It was not later donated. So, and it wasn't actually photographed either. So these are some of the artists represented in the collection, but not necessarily the actual paintings, because we don't actually have pictures of those. But Carlo Cignana broke on the left, and then Andrea Sarto, Italian, early Mannerist on the right. So some of it was historical art. A Dutch Golden Age painter, David Teniers, on the left, and Gerrit Douw on the right were represented in the Batterson collection. Guido Reni, High Baroque on the left. And he allegedly owned a Caravaggio, though people who study Michelangelo Caravaggio, I mean, any painting securely documented to Caravaggio would bring 20 million or more today, and might bring 50 million or more today. But according to the scholars, there were fakes around even in the 19th century, so we don't know which Caravaggio Batterson claimed to have, but that's Caravaggio on the right. And then he bought what they called modern masters, contemporary art being produced in Europe at the time. Andreas Achenbach on the left, Albert Kuip on the right, Dutch artists. Charles Leslie on the left, Cornelius Kookkoek, Dutch, on the right. And again, these aren't the pictures, but these are the artists that were represented, because we have a list of all the artists. Herman Tenkate on the left and right. These genre pictures of historical genre scenes. And then Charles Chagenet, I don't know how to exactly pronounce that, and Wouters Verschuur. These are both, again, Dutch artists that were, again, represented in the Batterson art collection. He goes from monuments to major construction projects, and you'd seen that little crypt in Cincinnati in the 1850s, the vault. So the firm gets involved, and he's related to the Goodwin family that had a lot of, they were very deeply involved in finance and insurance in Hartford. And in 1870, this was the headquarters they built of the Connecticut Mutual Insurance Company. And Batterson's firm was hired to create these allegorical statues, these figures that were part of the design of the building, right? So I forget who the architect was, I'm not sure, but they did the statuary for it. Unbelievable. No, that was demolished in the early 60s. And what happened to the statues, who knows? You know, a lot of things get lost. It's sad. Amazingly, the Batterson firm became the general contractors that built the Connecticut State Capitol. He didn't design it. This is in the mid-1870s. The Capitol had provisions for a picture gallery and cabinet of artifacts. The Battle Flag Hall, where all the Civil War regimental flags are housed, even to this day, are impressive. It was designed by New York architect Richard Upjohn, but Batterson got the contract to actually build our state capitol in the 1870s. The figural statues, and there are these allegorical figures, if I can go back, all around on all sides of the dome. And Batterson's shop produced some of them. Others were produced by Chauncey Ives and John Quincy Adams Ward. So this was a big sculpture commission. I think our Capitol, this is great. It took me years. When the Capitol was designed, you'll love this. This is the way our world is today. OSHA and risk aversion. Too many lawyers, forgive me if any are in the audience. But when the Capitol was built, the dome was designed for tourism. It has this wonderful gallery, and they had these stairs. The intent was to let people up into the dome, and it is absolutely thrilling. But you have to get an act of Congress today, practically, to get into the dome. But I found a way to do it, and I was able to get up there one time and take these pictures. And it's just, it was a great view of the city. I wish we'd open it up again. But anyway, so you can see these figures, and our state capitol is just drenched in historical and allegorical statuary and these bas-reliefs that tell the story of Connecticut, and it's really fascinating. The amount of sculptural effort that went into making this incredible building what it is. And again, Batterson was the not the architect, but the builder, the building contractor, his firm. And these are all figures. This is John Mason, the guy we talked about. He's wasn't popular in Mystic, but he's still on the Capitol because he was, in those days thought to be a hero. And I know everything that was acceptable is now politically incorrect, and we may have to live with it. I don't know, but it's great. I love our Capitol. I give tours of the Capitol sometimes, and it's the most exciting thing to see. After the Civil War, again, they continued, of course, to get monument commissions, and Reverend Thomas Brownell on the left was the founder of Trinity College. On the right is in Cleveland. I was interested. You have wonderful documentation, and you may very well have documentation for this Hurlburt. I didn't see it, but if we went back to that index, and you've been out there, you may have photographed this anyway. But it's one that was signed, if I recall. And these are others, and it's interesting, the firm goes through various names. The book you have downstairs says BC and Company, I think, BC, if I got that right. What?
That's right.
BC and Company, well, that's Batterson, Canfield and Company. And so he briefly, I think for a few years in the 70s, had this partner, I forget his first name, Samuel Canfield, I think. Anyway, so it's signed that way. But these are different examples. And after you've looked at these for a while, I find now when I go into graveyards, if I haven't seen them in a while, that I will sometimes spot things right off and think, that looks like a Batterson. And sometimes I'll see it signed, and sometimes it won't be. And so you can't always document them for sure. But these are examples that are, everything I'm showing is documented. It was interesting, your records downstairs, there was one example like this one on the left that I saw in that book, and there may have been others. But that is sort of a horizontal crypt. It's really quite interesting. And that's in Cedar Hill in Hartford. And the one here is in Warehouse Point, Connecticut. This I thought was amazing. I've only ever seen, this is out in Salisbury, Connecticut. And what this is the form of it are something I've seen Batterson do, the shape, and it's got this kind of sort of modern Gothic look to it, sort of in the style actually of the state capitol. And the figure's not that rare, but what is unusual is this portrait. And I am sure that this was actually based on a photograph, and that somebody's job was to translate the photograph into stone. And I'm sure that was costly, and I don't know it to have been done. I've only ever seen this one example, at least by the Batterson firm. I've seen other portrait stones, but not many. They're rare.
Where is that one?
Oh, that is in Salisbury, Connecticut, Northwest. So he goes on this business. It's unbelievable. He gets a commission to build Marble House in Newport. He gets the commission to build the pedestal under the Statue of Liberty, which is probably cost more than the Statue of Liberty. I mean, all of this stonework, this is all from this New England Granite Company. And probably it's Westerly granite. I don't know. But the Statue of Liberty, it's not just a statue, it's a pedestal. And it was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who was a very famous architect, did a lot of stuff in Newport. He built the Library of Congress in 1889. I mean, it's unbelievable to think of somebody going from making little tablets in the Litchfield Hills to 40 years later building the greatest monuments of the Gilded Age and still making monuments. And he's running Travelers Insurance on the side. So it's pretty amazing. Augustus St. Gaudens, if you ever get a chance to do this, make time if you can. If you've never been to St. Gaudens' home and studio up in Cornish, New Hampshire. It's right up I-91. It's not that far north. I think it certainly would make a lovely day trip. And they have concerts and things. The gardens and grounds are amazing. It's one of the most joyful things, if you've never been, to go to St. Gaudens' home and studio in Cornish, New Hampshire. And he was a sculptor, and really the most famous sculptor of this era. And this is a portrait of him doing his sculpture by a painter named Kenyon Cox. Painting's actually at the Met in New York City. But again, it gives you I get goosebumps thinking about this moment in American art when sculpture was king, and people loved it. And it meant that these guys in Westerly who were monument makers, maybe they didn't get the commissions for the iconic works of art, but they were in the same trade, doing the same thing with the same skills, often creative. It was pretty cool work, and it left a legacy that here we are still talking about it years later. I don't know, I'm looking at, thinking, I've got some notes here about Batterson's house. The Battersons knew a lot of influential people. And I don't know where I stumbled on this, but George Armstrong Custer's wife lived for many years. He obviously didn't make it past the Battle of Little Bighorn. But the wife survived, and she was always sort of a spokesman for him, wrote a book about him and made sure people remembered Custer in the way she wanted him to be remembered. Anyway, she was a guest at the Batterson's house and spoke about garrison life on the frontier. They would have social meetings of the Greek Club, politics, civic icons. And again, the Batterson, if there was a Mount Rushmore for the most influential figures in Gilded Age Hartford, Batterson would unquestionably be on it. And I have hardly even mentioned the insurance company that he founded, which is, the insurance industry made Hartford. It wasn't the only thing. Hartford had three things going for it economically: insurance, manufacturing, made guns, among other things, but many other things. And then, believe it or not, tobacco. The tobacco industry was huge, and a lot of people made money on that. So from 1850 to 1900, for about 50 years, Hartford was just minting money. And you can tell that. You visit and you look at the Capitol, you look at some of these buildings. And James Batterson was a giant figure, and literally giant, because that's inside the Travelers Insurance Company, larger than life figure of him. He's buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery, not the most artistic gravestone, but it was 1901, and the fashions of the 1870s had passed. How can I get back to that? Let me see if I can do this. This is my last little slide. Let me just see. Yeah, my last picture. So in conclusion, a newspaper profile of Batterson in 1872 described him as an indomitable man of business, constantly devoted to enterprises that give employment to a great number of laborers and increase the wealth and add to the business of this community. A person of untiring energy and vast capacity for labor, and the originator and director of new and far-reaching enterprises. Though one of the busiest men, the author observed, Batterson made time for civic affairs, having, among other things, recently accepted a place on the board of the street commissioners, just created. Although not trained as an architect in what is called the regular way, he had studied the subject for many years. The results are apparent and demonstrate a compelling, if not always aesthetically inspirational, alternative to the more familiar models. Art is what we make of it. The ability to see art broadly and recognize unorthodox pathways widens our understanding of art in America, and in this case, the interesting intersections between art, industry, tradition, and innovation. So thank you for having me down here. I'm so proud of what you guys are doing with this. It's really, really important, and I know it's tough sometimes. We are all, what I do is, people, whether it's special or not, I can't tell. That's somebody else to tell. But we are often what do they say? Never a prophet in your own land. So if the people of Westerly don't entirely get the importance of what you're doing, and I'm sure many do, but if they don't all get it, I do. And thank you so much.
Did he have children?
Yeah, yes.
And are they, have you talked to them?
Yes, great question. And I don't know, yes, there are lots of descendants. And there's still a lot around Hartford, and they're still living off the money, some of them.
And do they have any records?
No, and it's unbelievable. Everyone I've talked to blames somebody else in the family for hoarding them or losing them or something. And I have really tried. I mean, I've probably had, over the past 20 years, involved conversations with 5 or 6 descendants, some of whom don't even know each other. There's a chance that somewhere in a trunk are records we haven't seen, but I'm kind of doubtful at this point. And certainly the family appreciate what I've done to promote him. They a whole bunch of them. I think we all went out to dinner after I debuted this presentation a few years ago, but they scratch their heads and don't know for sure what happened to the records, and they had to have existed. Yeah.
What became of the Batterson company?
Did they merge?
Bought out the westerly portion of it, and I think the Concord Granite was bought out by somebody up there.
They hung into the 1920s, as best I know, but I think
By
it.
the time his son died, James Jr.
Okay.
Whatever, just about the time that they
He died, I think, in 1901. James,
James,
our guy.
his son.
But the son was probably around into the 20s, and as we were talking about downstairs, I mean, it's sort of amazing because this industry, and we're talking about all these Civil War monuments and all this craziness, this was like a 60, 70-year maximum phenomenon. From 1850 to about to World War I, monuments were big everywhere, and the scale of them was big, and the number of people employed was big. And after World War I, and particularly after the Depression, people still have gravestones, though not even all the time anymore, but they don't spend money like this. These Victorians were willing to spend huge money to do...
Pre-income tax.
What?
Pre-income tax.
Pre-income, there we go, that changed everything. It's unbelievable. And to me, we were talking about Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, which is just... If it were a museum, it would be one of the most interesting museums in America. It's just a sculpture park that takes your breath away. Greenwood Cemetery in New York City, and Mount Auburn and Boston, of course. And you've got a great one here. Hartford has a great one. But the Victorian age, even in some small towns, you will sometimes see these gigantic things. And of course, you instantly know somebody had to have had money. But they spent it, yeah.
I don't really have a question, but I'd just like to let you know that we were in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And we went to their
Bellefontaine, yeah.
And we were going to photograph all the Westerly Granite
Yeah.
monuments there. And we also knew of the New England Batterson monument.
Yeah.
And one of them was so big, he knew exactly where it was. And the guy that took us around, he said, "We've named the section of this cemetery after this monument." Because it was huge. And it's a signed Batterson.
No, there's stuff everywhere. And look, I don't want to complain, but I will. When I started this project, I had been working on this stuff for years, picking away at it, and I finally said, in 2013 was the 150th anniversary of Travelers. And I thought, God, if I'm ever going to develop a presentation about this and finish this, not finished, it's never finished, but if I'm going to bring the project to a point where I could present what I've just presented, let's do it now. And I thought, it wouldn't hurt. I'm a consultant. I only get paid if somebody chooses to hire me to do something. So I thought, well, Travelers, for what they make in 1 second, not a minute, 1 second, I could have put together for them a booklet, an exhibit, something that would have brought the story of their founder up. And I would love to have done this. And their corporate response was, we merged with this company in St. Paul 10 years ago, and we now think of their founding date as our founding date. So even in the city of Hartford, they didn't want to think much about anniversaries because it got in the way of their corporate enlightenment, whatever it is. And I just thought, God, ingratitude, how do you spell that? I mean, I couldn't believe it. And what? D-U-M-B. That's it. And whatever. And I'm sure I think the public would have loved it. I think it would have been good PR for not that they need it, but good public community relations to celebrate their own history.
We'll invite them down to look at our.
Well, there we go. That's it. They'll all come. They'll bring a buzz. But it's good stuff, and I think these stories are incredibly interesting. And most towns would feel like they died and gone to heaven to have a story this rich to work with. Everybody's got local material to work with, but not everybody has something like this that is really unique. So good. Thanks.
Were you able to figure out what role he had on the Library of Congress?
What road?
What role?
Oh, well, I think that they built that building, that they were the contractors.
Did you have any?
Documentation on that?
Yes.
Newspaper articles is all. Which don't
all
always.
All I've said, seen is he had a contract for the Smithsonian Library of Congress, and never really specific.
Yeah, and
what.
somebody there.
You can be doing anything from making the steps to.
Absolutely, no question. And I don't go into it much because I don't know you're asking exactly the right question, and I should know, but I don't. And I think that somebody at the Library of Congress surely would know.
And why are you here?
Yeah, but I never. And the same, and the same.
I've looked for, and I've never.
And this now I
nailed it
have
down.
corresponded with the People's Preservation Society